We said in one of our publications that it would be one of the things that might be good if you could do it safely and biologically safely would be to add something to the water supply, excuse my laryngitis, add something to the water supply that would make you have to take an antidote before you could have a baby. And everybody said, that's just terrible, that's ghastly. Ghastly? It'd get rid of the whole abortion problem, get rid of the whole unwanted child problem, make people make rational decisions. It's certainly one of the things that every government must pay great attention to is the size and composition of its population.
Hey everyone, welcome to my channel Anarchy for Freedom, India's home for conspiracy research and free thinking. A lot of you guys like my videos, but if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do so, as it's only the subscriptions that will help the work move forward and help this channel reach out to more people. Also, if you want to get my work in a direct fashion and not rely on YouTube, which I would suggest you do because the content is a little controversial and I don't know how long my channel will be around on YouTube, I recommend you subscribe to my email list, which I've put in the links down below. And also, please check out my website, Anarchy for Freedom, wherein I've presented material which can help you take a deeper dive into the subject areas that I'm discussing here. And if you want to support the work that I'm doing, please take the time and go to the recommendation section on my website, because I've put up a list of book recommendations that I have gained a lot from over the years in terms of understanding the world and what is going on in the world. And if you want to support me, you can click on the book covers over there, which will take you to Amazon, and I'll get a small reward for you buying the book through my link. So please consider it if you want to purchase the book and deepen your understanding at the same time help this channel. Also, I'd like to apologize for my previous video, which had some sound issues. I realized the problem after I got done recording the whole thing, and since this is all a one-man show and I'm recording the videos and I'm editing the videos and I'm doing literally everything to put this up online and there's no one to do it for me, it is very difficult for me to spend that much time recording a video and then go back and do it all over again. So I tried making it sound as audible as possible. And this video is a continuation of the previous one. So if you want to gain full value from it, I'd recommend put your earphones on and put the subtitles on and watch the video, because there's some really important stuff in there. And if you don't understand some of it after watching it, I'll summarize the contents right here in this video. In the prior video, I took you through the history of eugenics and the history of the population control movement in India. And to sum it all up, eugenics was basically an ideology wherein the elite believed that the socially inferior classes had the social characteristics that they did in terms of being poor, or in terms of being more likely to be a criminal, or in terms of being an alcoholic. They thought that those characteristics were a result of their genes, and that the poor and the socially inferior classes were destined to be so because of the genetics, and that the rich and the powerful were that way not because of any undue influence on government or because of the massive wealth that their families had amassed through immoral means in the past, but because of their genetics. The elite families of the world who sit on top of the global power pyramid, like the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the British royals and the Dutch royals, along with certain other sub-families like the Harrimans, the Warburgs, the Schiffs, etc., took over and monopolized the oil industry, and through monopolizing oil, they were able to monopolize key areas of our life, like pharmaceuticals, like education, like genetically modified crops, like the gene revolution, like the green revolution, like banking, and many other areas that they use their monopoly on oil to basically take over. And these families caught on to the idea of eugenics and promoted it with their heart, soul, and all their money because it perfectly explained their position in society, and it gave them a moral justification to do things that would eliminate these socially inferior classes and have a scientific basis for doing so, in their opinion. Because of the funding this idea and its implementation received from these elite families like the Rockefellers and the Harrimans and others, there was a time in America in the early 20th century wherein many states in America had forced sterilization laws, meaning that people were forcibly taken and sterilized, stopped permanently from having children by the state. And this was horrific enough because it was very subjective. The state decided who they considered to be feeble-minded or who they considered to have problematic social characteristics. And the Rockefeller Foundation mainly exported this idea to Nazi Germany. And believe it or not, it was actually the Rockefeller Foundation that was behind the funding of the Nazi eugenics movement, wherein 4 lakh Germans were sterilized by 1945 against their will. And the same Nazi eugenics program eventually expanded to become a euthanasia program, wherein small children and elderly people were exterminated and killed by the Nazi regime. Eventually, we also saw how the same families that funded this twisted ideology and sponsored it into existence after World War II reinvented the same ideology under the name of birth control, population control, and the like. Because the term eugenics became a very dark term in the minds of people after what Hitler did in World War II. So it needed a reinvention of sorts so that they would be able to continue the same goals of reducing the inferior classes and forcefully sterilizing people under a more suitable cover. These same organizations that funded the eugenics movement, like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegies, the Ford Foundation, and certain other organizations of the UN that emerged after World War II, were involved in pushing this eugenics program in India in the name of population control. And in the previous video, we saw how these organizations had been involved through 1950s all the way up till now, I would argue, in family planning and population control efforts in India, which also evolved into forceful sterilization. And the most common example of that is the emergency that took place in the 1970s by Indira Gandhi, where up to 6 to 8 million people were forcefully sterilized and a lot of dissidents were jailed and some were even murdered back then. Even up to this present day, I would make the case that most states in India have targets for sterilization to reach, and the states are involved in bribing people and using various tactics to intimidate them into getting sterilized. And sometimes it happens against their will as well, as I've shown you with cases in West Bengal and Bihar in the previous video.
Devanti Devi, a 25-year-old mother of 3, is living in one of India's poorest states. Just a few months ago, she went for an operation to be sterilized. Unable to afford or access other forms of birth control, Devi thought the operation would help her family, but it went terribly wrong.
I gained consciousness around 12 or 1 in the night. I was made to lie down on a bench. I was bleeding heavily on that day. I came home without being given any medicine.
As mandated by the Indian government in its attempt to curb India's growing population, around 1 million women from Devi's region are sterilized every year. She says around 80 women were operated on at this school in just 3 hours in January.
And we can see this now with our Prime Minister Narendra Modi likening having small families to being more patriotic, and a lot of people from the BJP who are filing petitions in courts and trying to pass bills to get population control enacted in India, proposing that those who have more than 2 children should have certain benefits taken away from them and should be stopped from voting and the like. I made this video to basically explain to you about how we've been brainwashed and programmed into thinking that we are burdening the planet by reproducing and increasing our numbers, and why overpopulation isn't actually a problem. And in the conclusion of the video, I'm basically going to show you how the world is not going to a place of overpopulation, but we should actually be concerned about the falling numbers of the people that are taking place on our planet right now. If you saw in my previous video, I showed you how the United Nations actually had a role to play in terms of bringing population control, education, propaganda into our schools and universities in India. And they even boasted about how it had penetrated down to the level of kindergarten itself. So we literally have people who, since the time they get into the education system, are being propagandized by the state to think that there are too few resources in the world and there are too many people, in an effort to make children feel like humanity is the cancer and we need to reduce our numbers in order to solve the crisis that these people are saying exists, but it actually doesn't exist. And it's this programming that we've received since childhood through the education system, which doesn't just extend in this area. I mean, it spans through a wide range of subjects wherein we've been misled to think certain things that aren't true. But it's because of this that when you bring up the subject of population to any normal, ordinary person today who hasn't looked into any of this, he will think surely that yes, we are burdening the planet and that we need to reduce our numbers by some way or the other. Along with this information being conveyed through the education system and people being propagandized in that way, we've also been bombarded with a slurry of this propaganda through movies, through leaders around the world, and even through some spiritual gurus.
The birth rate continued to rise and the population grew until now Gideon is encased in a living mass who can find no rest, no peace, no joy.
Then why haven't you introduced any of the new techniques to sterilize men and women?
Because it has been agreed by the nations of the world that the earth can no longer sustain a continuously increasing population. As of today, childbearing is herewith forbidden.
A new study from Lund University in Sweden says the single best way to cut your carbon footprint, assuming you want to, is simply to refuse to reproduce. Deleting some humans from existence, they say, saves far more carbon than, I don't know, being vegetarian, riding a bike to work, not boarding an airplane.
There is a study that says, well, actually, if we reduced global fertility by half a child per woman, that you could maybe do that. It would go a long way. It would reduce like a big chunk, a fifth to a quarter of all carbon emissions needed to avoid that tipping point.
So should we have policies that penalize people for having extra kids in the developed world?
So I do think that we should at least consider it.
Well, at least consider it is like do it.
In the push to reduce global warming, children, according to some, are the new culprits. A think tank in the UK says too many kids are what's making the planet worse, saying large families, anything over 2 children really, should be frowned upon as an environmental no-no.
The United Nations can and should play an essential role in helping the world find a satisfactory way of stabilizing world population. And growth is most efficiently managed by the private sector, but regulation of the process by national governments and international bodies is also needed. And once again, the United Nations should certainly be among the catalysts and coordinators of this process.
In the draft copy of the United Nations Global Biodiversity Assessment, it states very clearly that we must reduce the human population down to about 1 billion people.
जिस तरह से पॉपुलेशन का बाहर बढ़ रहा है, भारत उसको ढोने में सहने में तैयार नहीं। सड़कें कम, स्कूल, कॉलेज, हॉस्पिटल्स कम, संसाधन कम, खेती कम, अनाज भी कम हो जाएगा। आखिर भारत कैसे सरवाइव कर पाएगा? इसलिए भारत की आबादी आने वाले 50 वर्षों में भी 150 करोड़ से ज्यादा नहीं होनी चाहिए, उससे ज्यादा की आबादी सहने के लिए हम तैयार ही नहीं। और यह तभी हो सकता है जब कानून बने देश में कि 2 से ज्यादा जो भी बच्चा पैदा करेगा उस बच्चे को वोटिंग राइट नहीं होगा, चुनाव लड़ने का अधिकार नहीं होगा, और सरकार की ओर से जो भी सुविधाएं दी जाती हैं उससे उनको वंचित कर दिया जाए। तो फिर लोग ज्यादा बच्चे पैदा नहीं करेंगे, चाहे वो किसी भी मजहब के लोग हैं।
If the world population can be reduced to 1/4, there will be no poverty, no violence. Thousands of problems will disappear. Absolute birth control is needed at least for 2 decades. Absolute, I say. Not that you have to stop after 2 children or 3 children. No, that will not help. Unless we cut the world population, there is no way to avoid violence.
The most important thing is this. The beginning of 20th century, we were just 1.6 billion people. Now, 2019, we are 7.6 billion people. Now, they are saying by 2050, we will be 9.6 billion people. Why are we making these predictions? Why don't we have a plan? Why don't we say in the next 50 years, we will be 4.5 billion people? Are we willing to address this? This is what needs to be addressed. It may look like there are many problems, but actually there is only one problem. We are nice, but we are just too many. This we need to understand. There is no space for any other creature to live on this planet simply because we are so many and our footprint is so big. So we are trying to reduce the size of our footprint, I understand that. But believe me, it is much easier to control human population than human aspirations. You cannot control human aspirations. You can easily control human population if everybody is focused on that. The nations, the religions of the world, various community leaders, everybody, if they are focused on seeing how to bring down the population of this planet, human population, so that other populations can live. If you want a solution, human footprint has to come down. I was in one of the conferences when I said footprint has to come down. They asked, how? I said, we just have to have less feet. There are too many feet on the ground. Each one of us have 2. That's the problem. So if we do not bring down the populations, if we do not aspire or plan to bring down human populations, do what you want. You are trying to handle a cancer with Band-Aid. Till we have a clear-cut plan that in this many years we will bring the population to this place. When we have the sense to go to Africa or to even in India, that elephant population is too much, so we must cull it because it's too much for the habitat. When we have that much sense, how come we don't have sense? I'm not talking about culling human beings, I'm saying we can control the birth.
ये जनसंख्या विस्फोट हमारे लिए, हमारी आने वाली पीढ़ी के लिए अनेक नए संकट पैदा करता है।
In 1988, Prince Philip uttered his deplorable comment, "In the event I am reborn, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation." In the 1990s, Ted Turner told Audubon magazine that a total world population of 250 to 300 million people and 95% decline from present levels would be ideal.
Around the same time that eugenics came into existence through Galton and his bundling of ideas from Darwin and Herbert Spencer and Mendel, there's also a man named Thomas Malthus, who was kind of the early originators of this idea of overpopulation. And this was a really twisted man who actually went to the extent of believing that famine and poverty were a God-given gift to control the human population.
Malthus himself, an Anglican minister, wrote that we are bound in justice and honor formally to disdain the right of the poor to support. arguing for a law making it illegal for the Anglican Church to give any food, clothing, or support to any children. Not content with consigning thousands of children to death for the misfortune of being born poor, however, Malthus also advocated actively contributing to the deaths of more of the poor through social engineering. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations, but above all, we should reprobate scientific remedies for ravaging diseases and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought that they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders.
These ideas of Malthus also aided to justify the eugenics movement, and a lot of people were inspired by his ideas and took them to their literal conclusion, which is that we need to reduce the population in order to save ourselves from these problems. One of the more prominent people who emerged in the past century, who really brought these ideas into a public spotlight, was a man named Paul Ehrlich, who, through his writing of a book called The Population Bomb, emerged in the 1950s as a global figure to be looked up to when it came to opinions and discussions on the global population and population control. This man has had numerous numbers of accolades showered upon him and been felicitated by many organizations all around the world, despite being wrong year after year after year on all the predictions, actually most of the predictions I would argue, that he made in the course of his career.
As far as petroleum goes, you all know that where the action is there. We're running out rapidly. Some estimates are it'll all be gone by the year 2000, and conflict over that is getting to be rather serious. You just got to remember this. There's no way out of the arithmetic. There will never be 7 billion people in the year 2000.
Sometime in the next 15 years, the end will come. And by the end, I mean an utter breakdown of the capacity of the planet to support humanity.
Incredibly, these predictions of doomsday are no mere aberrations in the career of an otherwise careful and understated researcher. In fact, they barely scratch the surface of the catalogue of Ehrlich's ridiculous and ridiculously wrong Chicken Little pronouncements. Speaking at the Institute of Biology in London in 1969, Ehrlich opined that, if I were a gambler, I would take even money that England will not exist in the year 2000. Population will inevitably and completely outstrip whatever small increases in food supplies we make, Ehrlich told Mademoiselle magazine in 1970. The death rate will increase until at least 100 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death during the next 10 years. And what of the decade after that? Writing about the Great Die-Off in the pages of The Progressive in April 1970, Ehrlich warned that 4 billion people would starve to death in the 1980s, including 65 million Americans.
It would only be bad enough if this man was seen as just having some crazy predictions and considered to be so by the public, but he held an enormous influence on governments and public policy all around the world, and these were some of the solutions that he offered to counter this problem.
Protestations aside, forced sterilization programs were indeed something that Ehrlich discussed frequently and in great detail in his early work on the population issue. That is, before the public fully realized the horrors of his ostensible solution to the population crisis. In 1969, the New York Times reported how Ehrlich had told the United States Commission for UNESCO that the government might have to put sterility drugs in reservoirs and in food shipped to foreign countries to limit human multiplication. A 1972 article in the Boca Raton News noting this proposal decried Ehrlich as worse than Hitler and pointed out how he opposed efforts to lift the Chinese out of poverty. It also quoted him as suggesting that some form of world governance was going to be necessary to institute international policy planning to save the globe. But most damning of all is Ecoscience, a 1977 textbook co-authored by Paul Ehrlich, his wife Anne, and John P. Holdren, who would go on to become Obama's science czar. In this book, they not only double down on the idea of adding sterilants to the water supply, noting that no such sterilant exists today, and lamenting that it would have to clear a number of technical hurdles in order to be acceptable. But they actually go so far as to argue the constitutionality of population control and even forced abortions, concluding that such a practice could be sustained under the existing constitution. In this book, they also greatly elaborate on the type of world governmental body that would be required to enact a truly global population control program, calling it a planetary regime, which they describe as sort of an international super agency for population, resources, and environment. They argue that it could control the development, administration, conservation, and distribution of all natural resources, renewable or non-renewable, at least insofar as international implications exist, including all international trade and all food on the international market. The planetary regime might be given responsibility for determining the optimum population for the world and for each region, and for arbitrating various countries' shares within their national limits. Control of population size might remain the responsibility of each government, but the regime would have some power to enforce the agreed limits.
Paul Ehrlich was challenged in his ideas by another scientist that came up who's less well known and has received less attention, called Julian Simon. And Julian Simon actually won bets against Paul Ehrlich for proving him wrong on his predictions, and Paul Ehrlich actually paid him money for being wrong in his predictions. It might seem counterintuitive to us to think that the world population is too much and that the planetary resources are few, so we need to reduce the population because otherwise we'll run out of resources. But what we don't understand in this process is that the Earth is not a zero-sum game. And there is a factor involved of human ingenuity and imagination and creativity, which generation after generation has come up with better technology and innovative ideas in order to extract more resources from the earth while using more at the same time. We can think about this in this fashion, wherein 300 years ago, for example, we did not have oil as we use it today. And it wasn't possible to do the things back then that we can do right now with oil. So the invention of using oil in all the things we use it today actually increased the standard of living for most people and made the changes in society that it did. In a similar fashion, we might be wondering now that we're running out of resources, but human imagination works in ways that we cannot even comprehend. And the more the people there are, the more minds who are working on these subjects to create better technology, to create better ways to use things, to extract resources more efficiently. And who knows, we probably even go into space in the near future so that we can get a hand on more resources than we can right now because of the human intellect and imagination. So it's not as clear-cut as thinking that there are limited resources and if the population rises, then those resources will get less. But there's a factor of imagination and creativity and innovation that's involved in making that process better as time moves on. If you also saw my Agenda 21 video, that I'd highly recommend you go and check out because it will help you gain a deeper understanding of what I'm talking about here. We saw how the government has a war on tribal people, not just the Indian government, but governments all over the world have a war on indigenous and tribal people. And through economic policy, through global bodies like the IMF and World Bank, and through government policies, they are doing everything they can to move people from native and rural areas and move them into these urban smart cities, which is where they want us to live in the future under Agenda 21. And this is also a very key point to remember in this whole conversation, because we think that Mumbai is so crowded and there's no space for us to do things and live in a relatively peaceful and suitable fashion. But we also have to consider how the social engineers and the global elite are using various ways to pack us into these dense urban areas in the first place that don't often get recognized by the people at face value. The truth of this matter, like in most other cases, happens to be totally different from what most people perceive it to be. Instead of overpopulation and rising populations, we now have a crisis of depopulation. wherein most of the industrial and developed nations over the world are facing a population crisis, wherein the total fertility rate in those nations has reduced below 2.1. The total fertility rate is basically the rate at which a couple would produce children. And what I'm saying is that number has actually gone below replacement level in a lot of nations.
It's becoming harder to hear the crying of newborns in Korea. The nation's birth rate has been on a steady decline over the past 40 years. Currently, it has the lowest birth rate among the 34 OECD member countries.
Italy is struggling to escape recession and bring down record high unemployment. Even if it manages that, it may still face its biggest economic challenge ahead, which is having one of the lowest birth rates in the world and a rapidly aging population.
Japan's leaders are working on a raft of new measures to encourage citizens to get married and have children in a bid to boost the country's flagging birth rate. With fewer babies being born and a rapidly aging population, Japan is facing an unprecedented demographic crisis with vast social, economic and political repercussions.
Spain has always had a low birth rate, but the impact of the financial crisis and high unemployment has further tipped the demographic balance. The number of births per year has dropped almost 13% since 2008. Today, the average household has just 1.3 children.
The world's most populous country has a dangerously low birth rate. A recent report from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences says the fertility rate in China is now 1.4 children per woman, close to the global warning line of 1.3 or the low fertility trap.
Fewer babies are being born in the United States. The latest birth statistics, released by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, show birth rates in this country are at a record low.
With its rapidly aging population, Greece is not only facing a demographic time bomb, its young generation is in the firing line of what a sociologist calls genocide or annihilation.
This case of depopulation also holds true in India, wherein the global elite and the organizations that they've controlled engineered the whole population control movement and gave our government funds and the things needed to push it in India. And they were successful in reducing the total fertility rate from around 6 in the 1950s to being an average of 2.3 now. And most Indian states are around that level, and some states are like Bihar and others are around the 3 mark. They're barely 2 or 3 states. And even they have reduced the total fertility rate over the past. So these people have been extremely successful in reducing the fertility rate, and despite that, they are still calling for population control laws and things like that now to forcefully keep the population at a certain level, because they just don't want to stop at maintaining the population where it is. There are a lot of things to suggest that they want to reduce the population down to a number like 1 billion or 2 billion, somewhere around those lines. I'll be showing you the reasons for why I believe there is an intended push to take the global population to that 1 billion area mark, and how the global elite and the secret society networks and the structure that they've set up is working to push that and reduce the population intentionally in various different ways. I hope you've got value from this video and have a better understanding of this population issue now. And if you like this video, please share it with your friends and help this message get out to more people, so that we can understand what these elite are really trying to do with this issue and how we are being led down a very dark and sinister road towards a place where all our freedoms are going to be taken away if we buy into this nonsense. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.